Hello Bio20 and welcome to our video on habitats, niches, and the intro of ecosystems biotic factors. What will you be learning today? Today you are going to learn how terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems support diversity through habitats and niches. How do we know we've learned this is by being able to explain the difference between an aquatic and a terrestrial habitat, defining habitat, defining niche, and explaining how niches allow animals to live in certain habitats without too much competition. So to start off today's lesson, we're going to have to go through some key vocabulary. And why we need to do this is because now these are going to become words that you're going to see often and need to start incorporating into your conversations when you're talking about ecosystems. So the first thing is the environment. When we say the word environment, what we mean by that is anything that affects an organism throughout its life. It also is reversed in the sense that it is also everything the organism affects. So sunlight affects the organism. An organism eating another organism affects the environment. So it's the interplay between the two. Abiotic factors mean non-living components of the environment, things that are not alive. Oxygen content, water, soil, sunlight, those are things that are not living. Those are what we would call abiotic. Biotic is the opposite. So A meaning like lack of, and then bio meaning life. So abiotic means lack of living. Biotic means living. So living components of the environment. Bio meaning living. Species is a very important one that we're going to talk about a little bit more as well, but you've already seen this definition and you've talked a lot about speciation. So species essentially is a group of organisms, that it can breed, but then also produce fertile offspring. So not only can they breed, but they have to have babies that can have babies. And that allows you to know that they're the same species. A population is a group of individuals of the same species, so they can breed and have fertile offspring. So same species, they live in the same place at the same time. So they're living in the same habitat at the same time. A community is now looking at multiple populations living together. So if you think of a community, you might have for example, a mouse community, a mouse population, a grasshopper population, and a rattlesnake population. These are now a community. They're different populations living in the same area. If we take that a little bit further and we say, well, a community is all these different populations living together, an ecosystem is now taking those communities of populations, so the mouse, the grasshopper, and the rattlesnake, and looking at everything that surrounds it and affects it. So the abiotic and biotic factors. So you have these three populations living together. How does water affect them? How does sunlight affect them? How does the soil affect them? How does other animals living in that area affect them? How does predation affect them? How does the eating relationships affect them? So those would be an ecosystem. Now the last definition, which is going to be very important as we talk through this lesson, is called limiting factors. Now limiting factors are essentially anything living or non-living that stops your population growth. So if you think about living in an environment that has little water, water is very, very important for us as humans. If we don't have enough water, people will become extremely dehydrated and die. So water would be an abiotic limiting factor, meaning without water, you can't reproduce to have more individuals in a population because those individuals will die out. So it's anything within a population that stops your population growth from getting out of control. So make sure you have these vocab words. We are going to talk a lot about them, and I'm going to be using them a lot within our lessons in the next little while. So it's very, very key that you start working with them, start thinking about them, going back to your vocabulary tier lists and maybe changing some stuff if you're like, oh yeah, now I understand what that word means, okay? But these are going to be very key as we move forward. So let's look at ecosystems. So again, defining an ecosystem is community of populations together that are surrounded by both abiotic and biotic effects. So these are two different communities, an aquatic ecosystem and a terrestrial ecosystem. Aquatic meaning water, so anything that lives in water. Terrestrial meaning anything that lives on land. So there's lots of similarities between these two types of ecosystems. There's many, many similarities that exist, such as they both have abiotic and biotic factors directly within them. They also both have to use the process of photosynthesis in some capacity or some sort of sunlight to get chemical energy. Now, we're going to learn in aquatic ecosystems that although photosynthesis can't occur, there is another cousin process called chemosynthesis that allows for you to get chemical energy. So both processes occur. And we do have transpiration in both. Now, those are just some similarities, but what is really important is to understand what makes them different. Why do some animals live in aquatic ecosystems and some animals live in terrestrial ecosystems? And what it comes down to is habitats. So differences include obviously the types of animals that can survive in that ecosystems. The food chains in the aquatic ecosystems are actually much more defined. They're not as big and food web as like you might see on a terrestrial ecosystem. The food chains are pretty defined in an aquatic one, but the big one is the habitat itself is extremely different. So the habitat itself creates a big difference between these two. So let's define habitat and talk about niche. So a habitat of a population is the physical area where the species lives. So if you're in a terrestrial animal, you're going to live in a tree, in a mountain, on some rocks, in some dirt. Okay, those are places habitat-wise that you may live. You may live in a forest. In an aquatic ecosystem, you live in the water. You may live in coral, you may live in a cave, you may live in digging in the dirt, but essentially you are surrounded by water. So your habitat is within the water. There's fresh water and salt water, so that is also a big difference. The habitat is very dependent upon the environmental conditions, and whoever lives in that habitat, it's the area where they're best suited for survival. So aquatic animals have been suited for aquatic living. So think about different adaptations that actually help you best suit this kind of condition. Gills on fish, tails on most of the aquatic animals so that they can swim, fins instead of hands. There's different things that you would have as an aquatic species that you wouldn't have as a terrestrial species because living in the water is very different than living on land. Now, there are some animals that can go between both. So what makes them different? What do they have that's a little bit easier for them in the water and a little bit easier for them on land? Habitat is where you live and where you best are able to survive. So this video you will watch later. It's about what is a niche, but I'm going to get into it right here and talk about niches. So an animal's adaptations, so how they develop, and those adaptations that they have, help them develop a niche in their ecosystem. If every animal ate the same type of food or lived in the same habitat, they would all die out. Competition would be too great. So adaptations occur, as we learned within natural selection, that give them an advantage. That develops their niche. A niche is a population's complete role in the ecosystem. So when you look at an animal, where it lives, what it eats, how it survives, is really its niche. So it's its job. It includes the biotic and the need for survival and how it survives. So what are some niches that aquatic animals have versus terrestrial? Think of like the sea anemone and the clownfish, Nemo. They have a symbiotic relationship. Sea anemones normally sting stuff. The clownfish doesn't get stung and it has a home, okay? Most other fish can't live in sea anemones. So what that means is the clownfish has created a niche for itself. It's created a habitat, a home for itself by having this symbiotic relationship. It fills a role within the population that no other organism can. So that's where its niche is. So let's look at the interactions inside an ecosystem, which is a lot about these limiting factors and the relationships that occur. So you now know a habitat and you now know a niche. Now a niche is about the role of the organism, where it lives and what it eats. So we're going to start talking about how things eat in an ecosystem. We're going to focus a lot in the next little while on terrestrial ecosystems, but keep aquatic ecosystems in the back of your brain. So in order to get into this, we need to talk about some generalized vocabulary. Some of these words you've seen before in grade 7. Some of these words are going to be new. So a producer. A producer is an organism that's able to use the sun's energy. Think plants. Now in Biology 20, we really want to lean towards the word autotroph. Okay, because we're going to use the word trophic to explain feeding levels. So autotroph is a really good word that describes organisms that are using the sun's energy to grow. Now, autotrophs can use other types of energy, and we'll get into that later on, but essentially for terrestrial purposes, they're using the sun's energy. Now, if we're looking at organisms that are obtaining their energy by eating other organisms, we call these consumers. Probably a word you learned in grade 7, producers and consumers. In Bio 20, we're looking at the word heterotroph, different things eating different animals. So we're looking at this relationship between autotrophs and heterotrophs, or what we call producers and consumers. And you can see here that there's a link between that in something we've already learned in photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Energy from the sun is made through photosynthesis. So this energy from the sun is used by autotrophs. It develops the energy for us, and then consumers use cellular respiration in order to obtain more energy and pass energy around. But there's a link because what carbon dioxide we breathe out, the producers use again to help them make food. So there's a whole interconnectedness that happens inside an ecosystem. So if we look really close at consumers, consumers are animals that eat other animals. We can now flesh that out into a couple more definitions. Herbivores. So herbivores is a term maybe you've heard before. It means that they are only eating plants. In the world of Bio 20, we term these primary consumers, the first consumers, the things that eat the autotrophs, because they're the first eaters of all the producers that there are. Then we can define loosely carnivores. They're animals that eat other animals. You've probably heard that word again, grade 7. However, in Bio 20, we're going to take the word carnivore and we're going to flesh it out into secondary consumer and tertiary consumer. What that means is secondary consumers usually eat the herbivores or our primary consumers. And tertiary consumers generally eat secondary consumers, or they may also eat the primary consumers. Tertiary consumers usually are the top of the food chain. Now, there could be quaternary consumers and all that. There can be multiple levels. But in Bio 20, we really go primary, secondary, tertiary. Sometimes we get into a few other levels. Omnivores is a loose term. Again, we're going to call them consumers, but omnivores mean they eat plants and animals. So you may have a secondary consumer or a tertiary consumer, such as like a bear that eats both berries and other animals. So then that would be something that's called an omnivore. And last but not least, we cannot leave out the decomposers, which is a key part to cycling matter through our entire ecosystem. So decomposers can be found anywhere on a food chain or a food web, because what they do is when something dies or there's organic waste left over, they return it back to the soil, back to the air, back to the water. They're the recyclers of the biosphere. So although when we look further, as we look at relationships and how limiting factors and biotic and abiotic factors interact, decomposers can be found anywhere in that space. So let's look at the relationship between producers and all types of consumers. This is the very last thing we're going to talk about. When filling the role of a niche or in a habitat, you're going to have animals that then create what we call a food chain because they rely on each other for food. So here's our producers, so things like plants. Again, we call those autotrophs. Those are eaten by primary consumers, or our herbivores. Primary consumers are then in turn consumed by secondary consumers, which can be carnivores or omnivores. And then tertiary consumers can be considered carnivores or omnivores. Now you will see decomposers can come into play anywhere along the line. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is considered a food chain. It is in one long link. These all have an effect on each other. These would be biotic factors because they have an effect on each other. And each of these fill a niche or a role within this food chain and within this ecosystem. Now you'll also notice that the arrows point this way. Okay, that is really key to understand when we're talking about food chains and food webs. The arrows have to point to what the energy is moving to. So the producers make lots of energy, and when they're consumed, their energy moves to the primary consumer. And we're going to get into that more as we talk. But please remember that when creating a food chain, you always want the arrows to point to where the energy is going, not what is being eaten. So if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know.